Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Liberty.me Live. I'm your host tonight, Mike Reid, and tonight I'm here with my dear friend, BK Marcus. Now, you may not know this, but BK was actually the original creator of the Liberty.me library and its 130 plus now books, all those free books for Liberty.me members. And most people don't know this, but BK actually gave me my very first job in the publishing industry way back when he was the managing editor for the Mises Daily at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. So it's wonderful to be reunited with BK here tonight. BK is now the managing editor at the Freeman over at Foundation for Economic Education, and he's done presentations associated with them on how to create great libertarian writing at ISFLC, the International Students for Liberty Conference, and also for the Charles Koch Institute. BK, it's just great to be back with you again. How are you tonight?
Good to see you, Mike. I'm doing well. Thank you.
How's your boy doing?
A moment ago, he was disappointed that a friend is moving to New York City from Charlottesville, but I think that he will survive.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that for BK's sake. So tonight, BK, I want to talk with you about one of the most important ways to get people to actually read articles that you write, not just share them on Facebook. You actually read the whole dang thing and enjoy it. And that thing is what you call a hook. Can you explain what a hook is? I've never had a really solid definition.
Well, yes, I'm going to actually skip over the hook. I'm going to answer your question by not answering your question and changing the subject. You and I both come out of ebooks. You were mentioning the Liberty.me library. And one of the very interesting things in the ebook industry is what the ebook stores do. Amazon Kindle is the easiest example of this. Anyone can download a sample. It turns out to be the first 10% of a book. And read that for free before they decide whether or not to purchase it. I think Amazon is trying to reproduce the experience that you have in a brick and mortar store of being able to pick up a book and start to flip through it and see whether or not you want to bother spending your money on it. And I think that the people who focus on ebooks have gotten very clever at hooking the reader, there's the word, in the sample, so that they know that they have a screen or two of your attention to grab you as a customer and convince you that you want to read the rest of the book. The hook in magazine writing is basically the same concept. You have a title and possibly a sentence to convince the reader to keep going.
That's it.
That's it. You got. Maybe they'll look at the subtitle, maybe they'll read the sentence, but really that first sentence is called the lead. That first sentence should also be what's called the hook, meaning it should be the thing that gets the reader on to the next sentence. Now, in the traditional wisdom for article writing is you put your hook at the end of the lead paragraph. Okay. And I think that often works, and if you look at some of your favorite magazine writing, you will see that. You'll see that the whole opening paragraph kind of counts as a hook. And if there's a specific sentence that grabs you and says keep going, it's at the end of the first paragraph.
Right, okay.
But the problem...
But you don't think that's the way to do it anymore?
I don't think it is, at least for online readers. I think that one of the things we have to recognize is not only do we have different audiences to address, we have importantly different media, whether or not you're opening a printed magazine page. Someone then might bother to read the whole first paragraph before they, physically exert the effort to turn the page. But if you're just going through your Twitter feed or looking at Facebook status updates or browsing around on a website, it's so easy to move on. You've got to grab their attention as quickly as possible.
Because they've got another tab and it's open on Facebook and their friends are messaging them about the party tonight.
Yeah, you and I have another tab. The people I talk to these days have like 100 of them.
So you say that there's the lead sentence has got to be a hook. That means it's got to grab the reader. How do you do that? Are there special things you're supposed to do? Are you supposed to drop a name or a date or have explosions or women or what?
I have a couple of lists here that we should go through at some point. I've sent you one of them as a PDF, and I think you're able to show that, but I don't want to go there yet, quite yet, because I want to talk about the general philosophy, if I can call it that, of establishing a hook. Is there a chance you could show a slide or two from?
Yeah, sure thing. Give me a moment. I'll show you a slide. Great. Okay, great. We got some slides up.
Okay, thank you. So that's just the cover. Could you go on to the next?
How the heck? The Lisa Simpson slide.
The Lisa Simpson slide. So I'm actually going to start with what not to do, and this is very much the emphasis of the editor of the Freeman, Max Borders. This is, and you see actually he's quoted there, "Death to the thesis statement." So yes, you asked me what a hook is, and instead I talked to you about ebooks. Now you've asked me how to write a hook, and instead I'm going to talk to you about how not to write a hook.
This guy.
We are trained as students to write a particular type of essay. We may in fact be trained to write a whole bunch of different types of essays, but an academic paper reads like an academic paper, even if there are differences among the different departments. None of that's going to work for a magazine article. The point of a thesis statement is to clearly communicate to someone who you know is already committed to reading the whole paper. And that's your professor, or maybe it's a couple of other students in a workshop if that's how you work. But basically there's an agreement that we're all going to read each other's papers, and that's how it's written. You write the opening with the shape of the essay in mind, on the assumption that all of your readers are going to get that whole shape eventually. We don't want to see any of that. I'm going to speak a little bit here as if I'm accepting a submission to the Freeman, since that's what I look through every day, and I'm going to talk that way. A lot of what we say, of course, is going to apply to the kinds of articles folks are posting on Liberty.me or on their blogs or elsewhere. You have to grab someone's attention. You can't assume, oh, you know what, could you move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I sure can.
If folks can see that.
You do not have a captive audience.
You do not have a captive audience. If there's one thing you take away from this chat, I'm giving it to you at 9:07. 7 minutes in. 7 minutes in, and you're getting the gold. The rule is you don't have a captive audience. And the first and last thing, actually, that's not true. The last thing you should be thinking about, I'll get later to the order of how to write an article. The last thing you should be thinking about before you share this with an editor or with your readers is, have you captured your audience? Have you earned their attention? And if you go to the next slide, we'll just blast through these slides. These slides, by the way, are something I put together for a Toastmasters talk, which was 5 to 7 minutes, so there's only a handful of them. They serve as a pretty good outline for what there is to say. Your first sentence has to get your reader onto the second sentence. When I say that, it sounds really, really obvious to me, and yet I'm confident that there are a lot of people who aren't thinking that when they're writing their first sentence. And it's okay, by the way, again, as I'll come back to later, to not start by writing your first sentence. But in the end, when you come back, the first sentence the reader reads has to get the reader to read your second sentence. Can you go on to the next slide for me?
Yeah.
Okay. You know what? I am distracted by this image of the hooks forming a heart.
They fall in love with the hook. That's the idea, right?
Yeah, I think what I was, when I was putting this together, that first slide showed a hook in a fish's mouth, which of course is where the word hook comes from and what the idea is. And I just was feeling uncomfortable with how violent.
Get those readers by any means necessary.
Yes, right. Rip. Yes, right. So I was very drawn to this heart image, and just shortly before we started talking, some other similes started coming to mind for me. I suspect that this will not travel farther than this conversation because people know what hook means, and there are probably reasons why they stick to it. But I was suddenly remembering my math tutor in college, who was an extremely good math teacher. I couldn't understand what the professor taught, but this math tutor was amazing, and everyone went to him. He was brilliant, but he was a little bit smarmy. And I remember going into tutorial session with him as a very attractive first year young woman was leaving, and I said something I can't remember. I'm sure it wasn't offensive about this woman, and the math tutor said to me, "Well, you know, teaching is like seduction." And I thought, you know, don't let too many people hear you say that. But in fact,
yeah, I don't think that's approved of pedagogy.
no, and I didn't know the term trigger warning at the time, or I would have felt one.
So were we going to call this the seduction sentence now?
Well,
Is that what we should call it?
No, actually, I don't want to call it the seduction sentence. I'm thinking that what I was thinking before we started talking, I was thinking about how the hook relates to the close, and we'll come back to that. I was thinking about the whole shape of a magazine article in terms of what you're trying to do with your reader, and suddenly this old math tutor's voice was back in my head telling me, well, you know, it's kind of like seduction. And at the time he was explaining to me the various steps of teaching and how it was like seduction. He was talking about having to understand how the student thought and felt about things and adjusting your message to her. And really, as creepy as that whole experience was, it was very educational to me, because all these years later, I'm thinking that what he was saying applies to writing, that you really have to think of it in terms of seducing your reader. And I'm hoping that this heart image makes it look innocent and loving and not creepy the way I experienced it. But that's really the case, and you have to think, you know, if you meet someone, wherever it is you meet potential significant others, and try a cheesy opening line and you lose their attention, well, okay, that was a failed seduction. If you say something to them intriguing that actually draws them into wanting to talk to you some more, that's the hook. And I think that that's not the worst attitude for a writer to take toward the unknown reader. You're trying to intrigue them. You're trying to get them to want to hear more of what you have to say.
It's like planning your first line for a blind date before you see the girl.
Yes, if you're at all good at that.
I really wouldn't know. The long years of marriage have really dulled my first date edge.
Right. So you don't want to open your first blind date by saying, "So are we going Dutch or?" So the best way to intrigue someone is to create a sense of mystery. And so even if you do not open with a question, even if your lead sentence doesn't end in a question mark, there's a sense in which you should be thinking of it as a question no matter what. And of course, it doesn't have to grammatically be a question for there to be an implicit question. And I'll give you an example. You were asking me about an upcoming Freeman article of mine. The title as I submitted it was, "Did Ice Cream Win the Cold War?" And Max changed the headline to, "How Ice Cream Won the Cold War."
But it's still a question. Like,
But
it's
it's
still
still
raised
an
in the reader's mind. The reader says, "How did ice cream win the Cold War?
Right.
Like nukes or armies or economic collapse win the Cold War?"
The question the reader asks specifically is, how in the world did ice cream win the Cold War? But I think you can generalize it. You want the reader to just say, "What the?"
Is that why people like this whole clickbait title thing with like,
Yes.
"You'll never believe this
Right.
one weird trick"?
Right. Look especially at list item number 5. Yes. Now, well, there are good ways and bad ways of doing this, and unfortunately, we've developed a terrible reputation in the online world for clickbait. So you have to. It's the really obviously clickbaity title or opening is a little bit like the cheesy pickup line. Right? You don't want to out yourself that quickly. You want to create intrigue. You don't want to just seem like a scam artist.
Yeah. Are you an angel that fell from the sky? Because you'll never believe this one weird trick.
Check out item number 3. So I'm gonna skip around here, which is appropriate to the way I think that one should write these pieces, I'm going to jump around from beginning to middle and end and talk about the relationship of the hook to the ending. Since we've already gotten into the question of false leads, of
Right.
misleading hooks,
Right.
you have to deliver. Whatever question you establish in the hook, you're going to have to unhook in your final line or your final paragraph. And you want the reader to feel you delivered.
So you have to both intrigue the reader and then follow through in the end. You can't promise, or like you can't start the date by saying, you know, this date could end in my Ferrari. But then
right. And
like,
then, right.
You have a bicycle.
You don't, right. You don't have the Ferrari. So yes, the question, so the hook, and when we talk about hooks and titles, they're a very similar approach here. The hook should get the reader to implicitly ask a question, whether or not you're explicitly asking one in the hook. And also, the reader is going to perceive a promise on your part that you're going to answer that question, and that you're going to answer that question in a satisfying way. They're not going to feel tricked at the end. And since I talked about jumping around, is it actually possible for you to jump to, I think it's the very last slide here, number 10?
Sure. Beginnings hook readers, endings create fans.
There you go. There you go. If I'm gonna return to my smarmy seduction metaphor, this is a long-term relationship. Right?
Well, you want it to be. I mean, you want people to keep coming back to your blog or to the Freeman or whatever it is.
That's right. Your sentence at the beginning of your article is what hooks the reader for that article, ideally. But the article itself should be hooking you, a reader, for a whole series of articles that you write. Basically, you are in fact trying to start a kind of relationship here.
Right. Right. Or you might be using one article to try to sell a book, or a series of articles to try and sell a product.
I guess, and this is, again, I'm sorry to keep going with things that might come off as smarmy, but all writing is a form of marketing. You're trying to sell something, and fortunately, talking to people who are fans of the market, they understand that that's not a malevolent thing.
Right, and especially we spend a lot of time in the Liberty space trying to sell ideas.
Right. You're trying to sell ideas. You're trying to sell your own voice as an authority for what you're talking about and for things in general. I'm reading William Zinsser right now, the writing coach who just passed away last week. And one of the things he says, which is wonderful, is writing is an act of ego, and you should just accept that early on. You're trying to sell yourself to the reader. You're trying to get them to care what you have to say.
Right, but this goes back to something you were saying earlier.
Oh, Mike?
Or author.
You might have frozen for me.
Okay. Oh, okay. This goes back to something you were saying about the William Zinsser author, his advice on great writing. And I think you had something you disagreed with, where he said you should ignore the audience. Writing is such an act of ego that and there's no audience.
Yes, it's really good when teaching to have a wonderful teacher you can agree with, or a wonderful source you can disagree with. We homeschool in the Marcus family, and one of my favorite things in doing history with my son Benjamin is first reading him what the text says, and then explaining to him why I disagree with the text. I think that sticks with him. It's not just suddenly that, speaking of questions, suddenly that becomes a question for him. Why am I treating this as authority? So I really like William Zinsser. I'm just introducing myself to him all these years later. I've seen his titles forever. I've seen him quoted forever, but only after he dies do I start reading him. He's wonderful and I recommend him, but he immediately says something that I think does not apply to the situation most of us are in. What he says is, don't worry about your audience. Write what interests you. If you get excited about your subject, that will come across. That's going to draw people in. Enthusiasm is attractive. I agree with all of that, but the problem is, I think Zinsser was really addressing people who largely did have captive audiences, or at least mostly addressing print audiences. And a lot of what I'm saying here is a more extreme version of advice you'll get elsewhere on the hook, because I'm very much focused on an online readership.
And so you think you do need to think about who the audience
You
is.
absolutely need to think about who the audience is. And it's okay to write to different audiences. If you are going to write to a specifically liberty-loving audience, you're going to write something very different than if you are writing for a general audience that you're trying to bring around to the philosophy of freedom. Here's an example. I know someone who was a very, very popular writer in the libertarian world who got a very attractive, lucrative job writing elsewhere. And within his first week, the people he was working with were saying, "What the heck is a statist?" And this guy had never had an audience that didn't know what he meant when he had talked about what statists believe. And I think that that's an example of what's important to keep in mind. If you and I are writing email to each other, there are all sorts of shorthands we're going to have to communicate ideas we already know we have in common. Statist is one of them, right? Even the word liberty is one of them.
Right. Has a specific meaning in our context.
We think we at least have a strong overlap in our understanding of what that means. But if you're trying to sell to an editor who you don't know, for an audience that is not this immediate audience, you can still have a lot of the same content, but you have to take a totally different attitude towards hooking that readership and not alienating them.
Do you think there's a way that you can really engage like a liberty-focused, liberty literate audience, let's say, and at the same time engage an audience that's only politically engaged but not kind of understanding the basics of the liberty idea?
Personally, I like writing that always tries to do that, even for an audience that you know is libertarian. If people self-identify as liberty-loving, they will forgive you for explaining what you happen to mean by laissez-faire. They're not going to be impatient and say, "Stop insulting my intelligence," and move on. They'll recognize that they are a specific case of your readership. And I think so long as you write about these ideas in a clear and compelling way, you might as well go for the general audience.
Oh, so you think in general, when you're writing kind of liberty stuff, very often it's easier to get the liberty audience because they know what you're saying, and you don't need to use the code words, and that in dropping those lets you get a broader audience without losing the liberty audience most of the time?
Well, I think it's actually, I don't know if it helps you get a broader audience. Again, it's going to depend on the context in which you're writing, but I think it's a really good habit to establish that you don't use code words when you can try to explain. If nothing else, it's good as writing practice to try to use new words to explain old things. And I know we're getting off of the topic of hooks here, but it's obviously going to be relevant. If you're trying to grab a particular audience, you want to first of all know who that audience is, and second of all, not take them for granted.
Yeah, so maybe your best hook isn't, "This statist broke the non-aggression principle."
Right, exactly. And that's the other thing, is you don't want to just say things that people are going to agree with, because some people absolutely want to read your article in which you say everything they already agree with, but plenty of people are going to nod and click the heart and move on without actually reading you. If your goal is to get read, you can't be doing that. Now, having said that, I have seen articles on Liberty.me that were clearly addressed to a very specific audience. They assumed that, and they were very successful and very popular. And I don't mean to be putting those down at all. Like top 10 reasons to date an anarcho-capitalist. I think that's a perfectly fine thing to write. And the person who's writing that knows who the audience is and doesn't expect that to get published at Salon.
Right. So maybe just the general lesson is thinking about your audience and making a conscious decision as to who you're writing for.
Right. I don't want to get too narrow in saying how you should write for your audience, which audience you should keep in mind. I think the most definite thing I'm willing to say is it has to be a conscious decision. You have to consciously decide who your audience is and how you're going to address them.
Okay. So
Oh,
Back to,
Josh Holden just said in chat that writing to a general audience might help make your stuff shareable among people who don't know what libertarian means.
yeah.
Which is a really good point. And I'm really glad you mentioned that, Josh, because that's another thing. I said people don't necessarily like reading what they already know they agree with, but they might like sharing it. They might like sharing it with the people they know don't automatically agree. So I don't want to make hard and fast rules about how to address your audience. I just want to say be conscious of it. It should be a strategy.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so in terms of actually getting that audience to read that piece, let's go back to the question of hooks here. Now, I know in your presentation of the Charles Koch Institute, you had like a set of types of hooks, like a taxonomy of like your basic ways to do it. We've been saying in general, you've got to hook the reader, you got to get their attention, you got to ask a question or make them intrigued. But what are some basic ways people can actually do that in their own writing?
Okay, well, first I should say, I hope we get a chance, probably not tonight, to talk about what I did talk about at Charles Koch, but hooks was just a tiny part of it. I was actually talking to them about the power of narrative, which is my particular favorite, and that's one.
We should do another show.
I would love to. I'd love to talk about why telling stories is the best way to do nonfiction. And that's one of the hooks that we can discuss here. But are you able to pull up that PDF I sent you, 14 types of hook sentences?
Yeah, sure. Here we are.
Can folks see that?
Yeah, I'll blow it up for everybody.
Okay. So I should explain, when I was preparing to do a hook workshop at ISFLC, I wanted to see what other folks had said on the subject. And almost everything I find is addressed to students writing college papers. But again, just as I was talking about with William Zinsser a moment ago and how important it is to see what you agree with and also specifically identify what you disagree with, what I like about this list of 14 hook sentences is that I think some of them are very good and I think some of them are absolutely awful and you should avoid them at all costs. So the first type that they list here is advice, words of advice that will make an impact on your readers. I would say if I were to rate that 1 to 10, with 10 the highest, that's maybe a 6 for me. I think
wait. So your advice about the advice hook?
My advice about the advice, yes. And now you get to give me a numerical rating on my advice on this advice.
Well, it's a 7. You know, it's fairly convincing because it comes from a guy I know.
I beat the PDF. Yes, my problem with words of advice. Again, I'm going to be talking a lot about the editor of the Freeman, Max Borders, because I have his voice very much in my head as I look at this stuff. He talks about the most important question that a submissions editor should ask when looking at something from the slush pile is, so what? Which, for whatever reasons in my head, I translate as, who cares? Whichever one of those works for you. So what? Who cares? And the reason it's good to know that is not so that you think of us submission editors as jerks. It's because that's really the critical question. We are proxying for the reader. That's our job, to try to anticipate what the reader is going to respond to. If you give me advice and I don't know who you are, why am I going to bother to continue reading? Unless there's something really bizarre about that advice. And I should give that caveat right now. Of everything here that I tell you is a terrible type of hook, there's probably a way in which you could turn it into a wonderful type of hook. So long as you get me to ask a question and to seek the answer by reading further. Number 2 on that list, I can't see if people are able to see it. I hope so. Okay, is anecdote. A short and amusing story about an incident or a person, usually famous. This in my 1 to 10 scale, I'd say 7 or 8. I like it because I like narrative hooks. I am a strong believer that humans respond to story, and the more we can leverage story, leverage the power of narrative as nonfiction writers, the better. But if you tell me a quick narrative about someone who's famous, I'm not sure why I'm going to keep reading. Now, again, if you start to tell me an anecdote and then change the subject for a moment, right? If you give me the beginning of a scene and then interrupt to say something, and what you're saying is also interesting, I'm going to stick around because implicitly you're telling me you're going to get back to that anecdote.
So if you open with not Bill Gates found some source code in a dumpster, but like Bill Gates found a blood stain on his floor.
Right. Oh, perfect example. There you go. That's great. So if you told me Jim Smith found a blood stain on his floor, that's kind of intriguing. I want to know what the blood stain is, but I already have a whole bunch of guesses. But if you tell me Bill Gates found a blood stain on his floor, that's a hook, right? Because I don't think that you're telling me a true crime story. I don't think that I know what the blood is doing there. I don't have any guess whatsoever. What the heck is the founder of Microsoft, one of the richest men in the world? Why is he looking at blood on his floor? You just hooked me, Mike. I want to know what comes next.
Well, I'll be able to write great articles as long as I can make up anecdotes about famous businessmen.
Right. Make it up. It doesn't have to be true. That's another thing. You actually can get away with that. You can sort of tell a parable or a thought experiment, but I really think the power of your hook a moment ago was Bill Gates in that narrative. I think that if people believe that you're going to tell a true story, they're going to care more. And if they know something about the story already, like they know who Bill Gates is, that they're more hooked. And if they don't know what the heck the blood is doing on his floor, there you go. Bam. I don't even want to leave anecdote. I feel like that was the powerful type of hook right there.
Okay, so what about the next one? Bold statement. Is it worthy? Where is it on the scale?
I'm distracted by Richard Mostad telling us that his favorite anecdote hook is from the writer who was hiding in a closet while J.D. Salinger received a pirate cooking lesson from Julia Childs, and he led us to believe they had an affair. Well, Richard, well before I got to the word affair, I was hooked on that scenario. Someone hiding in a closet. Oh, not a pirate, a private cooking lesson, a priat cooking lesson. Yeah, I like it. I want to know. I want to know more. I am so hooked by that I have lost track of where we are.
Bold statement. Bold statement.
Yes. So, a statement or assertion that arouses an opinion or response from your reader. Again, so many of these you can do right and you can do terribly wrong, and you have to keep coming back to that general question of, am I raising a question in the reader's mind in such a way that he or she will want to continue to seek out the answer? So really, you're doing more. You're doing much more than establishing a mystery there. You're immediately establishing a kind of authority in yourself as the author and a trust from the reader that you're going to deliver.
Right.
That it's worth sticking around because you will solve that mystery for them. You will answer that question. So a bold statement. Suppose I open an essay saying, you know what, I hate all women. Well, that's a pretty bold statement. Do you want to read my next sentence? I'm guessing you don't.
I feel a little bit squeamish.
Right. Why in the world would anyone want to know what the second sentence is from someone who opens that way? So it's not enough to have a bold statement. And I gave you a really good example of a terrible bold statement. I'm not coming up with a good example of a good one. I'll take one that's cliche. It's probably tired out in our community, but could still work outside our community. If you talk about policy that attacks the rich, hurts the poor. Right? That's not terribly interesting to you, I'm guessing, because you've heard it before. And I'm guessing that everyone watching right now has heard it before. But there are plenty of readers for whom that is going to come across as a very bold and very paradoxical statement. And if you can combine that with giving them the impression that you're going to satisfy the implicit question, what the heck is he talking about? How does attacking the rich possibly hurt the poor? If you've established the authority, which is tricky, but if you can establish a voice that lets them know, I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to do it in a very reasonable manner, then I think that that's an example of a bold statement that can be a very successful hook.
Mm. Mm. Okay, so what about the contradiction thing? Is that the same kind of thing? You need to do something that raises a question that engages the reader?
Right. So I'm going to not just keep repeating myself about raising a question, establishing a mystery, giving your voice authority. Let's take all those things as given. Assume that you're doing that. The contradiction, a pair of concepts that don't go together. Well, I kind of did that a moment ago in my example of a bold statement, right? Most people don't think that attacking the rich means hurting the poor. So that comes across as a kind of contradiction.
Right. So 1 to 10, where do contradictions rate? Are they just in with bold statements?
I may be conflating them, honestly. I need an example of a bold statement that isn't a contradiction. Because it seems to me that to make a bold statement that is also intriguing, it has to say something unexpected. It has to be paradoxical in that soft sense of paradoxical. Yeah. So I think bold statement and contradiction, I think we can kind of merge here.
Yeah.
Number 5, that's my favorite one. Can we go to number
definition?
5? Definition. Yeah. I gotta say, if you can figure out a way to take a definition as your lead sentence and make it a hook, I would really like to see it, because I think this is the worst the worst kind of hook. And I'm embarrassed to say I did it myself as a student, because I saw other people doing it and getting good grades, and I thought, oh, sure, okay, well, you know, Webster's defines monarch as, and
but this kind of goes back to what you were saying right at the beginning with the Lisa Simpson example, that yes, writing to get an audience is not the same as writing for your teacher who has to read it.
Yes, exactly. And you're reminding me of another anecdote. Sergeant York, famous Army hero who was a great rifleman, great marksman, and an incredibly good teacher of marksmanship, basically didn't want to teach anyone who had ever shot a gun before. Because he said they had too much to unlearn. That he'd rather take someone and teach them on a broom first.
Wait, hang on. You notice that that's a great hook anecdote and like a bold statement, because it's an anecdote about a guy's bold statement.
I leave you to be the judge of. I think of him all the time when one of the things that's really difficult about communicating certain aspects of the kind of writing we're talking about is that a lot of really smart, well-educated people have too much to unlearn. If we're trying to address smart and educated people, we're actually at a disadvantage. Smart is good. I like teaching smart. But teaching people who have been thoroughly schooled means having to do some unschooling. And the definition, well, I won't bang on the definition. It's my favorite example to hate.
Right. Okay, so hang on, we got 2 things. Let's do with Julian just has a great comment here, yes, trying to rescue the definition idea here.
Good for you, Julian. Challenge what I'm saying.
So Julian says, perhaps a definition most people wouldn't agree with. For example, the essence of government is force. And again, he's assuming an audience that's not, straight liberty audience.
Right.
Already.
Yes, I get what you're going for, Julian, and I think that it probably can be done. The problem with that specific example, and I don't want to harp on that example because we're all trying to come up with examples as we're going here, and we don't want to pretend they're our best work. The problem with something like that is I'm not sure it passes the so what question. You are defining something a way that I don't recognize. So what? You have to do more to get me to believe that. Now, if a famous person thinks that, or if someone who you think must believe the opposite is saying that for whatever reasons, then yes, starting with a definition people don't expect from you works for the same reason contradiction and bold statement work.
Yeah. Okay, and so let's go back one thing about bold statement. So if you scroll up a little bit, well, you don't have to scroll up, I'll read it to you. David Miller's got one. He's proposing a bold statement that might work. He says, quote, well, it's not really a quote, I'm quoting David Miller, one of your most powerful assets as a communicator is believing that you have all the tools you need to get your message across. Do you think that's a worthy, bold statement?
Is that what that is? It's an example of a bold statement?
I think that's what David means. It's an example of a bold statement.
David, is that what you mean?
So you should address it as if he does.
Should I? Well, I'm not sure it is what David means, but I'll pretend for a moment that it is. And where I go with it is back to William Zinsser, who I think is really not crediting some of the very specific craftiness we have to resort to to get someone to be reading us. I think that what Zinsser says about enthusiasm, about writing for yourself, writing what you think is interesting, and how that enthusiasm is going to be infectious, that can work absolutely in the middle of your article. If the reader has made it that far, it's fantastic to get to the point where they can share your enthusiasm, but you got to get them to the middle in the first place. And you believing something early on doesn't do anything for someone else who doesn't know who you are and why they should care that you believe it.
Right. Okay, no, I just want you to take a moment and notice that I've been completely vindicated about my interpretation of David Miller's suggestion.
Okay. Congratulations, Mike.
Thanks, David, for confirming. He says, yep.
See, maybe he's saying yep to what I just said. No? Okay.
All right, let's go back to the hooks.
Where are we? Number 6, dilemma?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like dilemma a lot.
Oh.
And that might be because my mind is immediately going to examples of it that work, whereas with some of these others, I'm really familiar with examples that don't. But what I like about the dilemma is if it really is a dilemma, if you're really putting the reader in the place of someone who has a choice to make between these two options that seem equally unattractive, I feel like I'm hooked. I'm hooked on that. I want to know what the outcome is. Mm-hmm. If I have a reason to care, if the dilemma is, oh goodness, I couldn't choose between chocolate and strawberry, maybe not. I assume though that's not what anyone's going to even attempt as an interesting lead for a magazine article. So yeah, I put dilemma up there. The other thing, of course, and I'm showing my hand here, is I like narrative, and a dilemma is almost always a kind of a narrative scenario. Not necessarily. You can be writing a more philosophical paper in which you say something like, in fact, I think I remember doing this, talking about the question of determinism, and can we both acknowledge free will and physical cause and effect? That's a kind of dilemma you're establishing for the reader. And so long as it's not a cliched one, so long as it's not one they already think they know the answer to, I think it can be an effective hook, even if it doesn't involve a narrative.
Okay. How about the next one? This fact one, 7 fact. I feel like they're going to let in with definitions. Am I right?
No, actually, I don't. I'm really glad you guessed wrong. I think that a fact is one of these things that can be wielded with precision, or it can just fall flat. It's going to have to be one of those cases of, so what? If you give me a fact and I have reason to believe it and it doesn't make sense to me, that starts to go back a little bit more towards what we were saying before about bold statement or contradiction. But it is separate. If you can tell me something, here's one that I've seen a couple of times recently. This is now familiar to me, but people talking about how, statistically speaking, the incidence of rape is much lower than it used to be.
Right.
That catches me off guard. That's not what I would have guessed.
Right.
Telling it to me as a fact and saying it, and we should talk about voice. I've been dancing around this question of having an authoritative voice. If you, it also goes back to the issue about using the word statist and using sort of in-group language. For all of these things, it seems to me you have to immediately communicate that you are reasonable. You can't immediately communicate that you are angry or that you're a member of a tribe and you're trying to test whether or not the reader is a member of the same tribe. If you immediately establish that you are reasonable, but you're saying something that the reader doesn't expect a reasonable person to say, that's a decent approach to a hook across all of these categories.
Mm. So what about a hook that tries to instill outrage in the reader rather than communicating outrage in yourself?
Yes. Well, that's the distinction. You've just pointed to exactly the distinction that I would make, which is if I show the reader how outraged I am, it triggers that "so what" question.
Mm.
It triggers the "who are you" question that I should care that you're outraged. But if I say something with confidence that it will outrage the reader without myself sounding outraged, I think that's much more effective for a hook. Because that doesn't do the work for the reader. That's letting the reader do the job that is the reader's job, which is responding to the content of what you're saying, feeling what they're going to feel about what you're telling them. I think it's a big mistake whenever you try to tell the reader how to feel or how to think.
Right.
Part of this idea of doing a reasonable voice is you're sort of laying out the evidence. There are boring ways of doing that and there are entertaining ways of doing it, but ultimately you're laying out the evidence and you are assuming that you are going to elicit a particular kind of response from the thoughtful reader.
Is this kind of the same as the overuse of exclamation marks? Like every time you use an exclamation mark, you're saying to the reader, "I'm excited," but what you really want is to say things that will make the reader excited for you?
Yes, there are certain things that I do when copy editing before I even pay any attention to the content. I remove all the double spaces, I correct all the em dashes, and I take out all the exclamation points.
All of them? You don't even check them over?
No, I do check them over. And I just left one in the other day, but they have to be very particular circumstances in which they're needed. It might make sense to leave it in if you're, well, it will make sense to leave it in if you're directly quoting someone. It might make sense to leave it in if you're implicitly quoting someone. The exclamation point is not you telling the reader how you feel and telling the reader how to feel. You're talking about how a third person is feeling.
But I notice it's notable that it's notable to you when there is a survivor of your exclamation point destruction process.
Yes, that's right. And I think that's a really good, that's a good mnemonic. I think the reason to take out exclamation points is a good kind of shorthand for a whole bunch of the stuff we're saying here.
Yeah. Okay, great. So what's next here? I think we're up
Well,
to
let me ask you,
yeah, go ahead.
We only have 12 minutes left.
Oh, yeah.
We have plenty of time. I'm fine going.
Oh my goodness, it's like we're only halfway in. Do you want to do one more? Like one that's really great or one that's really horrible?
We can do all of them, or we can do a few of them. I was just wondering if we wanted to make sure to open things up for questions. We can come back if there aren't any.
Okay, let's just. You're right. Let's just talk to the audience for a little bit.
I will want to come back to some that aren't on this sheet. Max has his own list that I wouldn't mind going over really quickly, but let's see if there are any questions.
Bruce Kerber asks, what about using an exclamation mark as part of a bold statement? We're back to this bold statement thing.
Right, I would say no. Do people not want to give up their bold statements? I mean, excuse me, do people not want to give up their exclamation points? I think that if your statement is bold, if it really is a bold statement, you don't need an exclamation point to point that out to someone. This, by the way, I worked for a guy who hated smiley faces and stuff in email and chat messages and things. And I don't want to come across as a complete curmudgeon, but he had an interesting point. He said, you should be able to communicate without emoticons.
And the exclamation point is just kind of an emoticon?
The exclamation point is kind of a pre-internet era emoticon.
And so I suppose if the interrobang had survived, okay, hang on, point of order, audience. The interrobang is a deceased and extinct punctuation mark that was the equivalent of like 2 question marks and an exclamation mark together at once. It's like the what? punctuation mark? And I suppose the interrobang would also not survive your editing if they still existed.
Well, the interrobang doesn't survive for an entirely different and much geekier reason, which is the Chicago Manual of Style says you can't combine terminal punctuation. So you have to choose. Is it a period? Is it a question mark? Is it an exclamation point? Here's a place where I have actually left exclamation points in. And I don't want to stand behind this as any kind of prescription, but it is true. I will sometimes leave an exclamation point in place of a question mark. But again, that's usually communicating what someone else is saying or thinking or whatever.
Yeah. So Ryan's asking, I think what Ryan is asking about is a different kind of hook, which is, what about opening with something that's really controversial? And he says how Israel is responsible for the Palestinian refugee crisis. Like, what about opening with one of those hot button issues that everybody's got a simmering, gnarly opinion about?
Yes. So I think that if we separate the question of the hook from the larger shape of the magazine article, which I keep wanting to come back to, I think that that's the kind of thing that can hook people in, but it is often hard to deliver on. That's the kind of thing where it's easy to get someone to read you once and forget about you entirely. I'm not sure, I would have to see an example, but I'm not sure how effective that is for building fans, building a reading base.
But I mean, there might be particular audiences out there for particular issues. I mean, you think about abortion debate stuff, there must be people who write abortion stuff every day and are famous for doing it, but they're probably building a particular audience on a particular space.
And they're not surprising their readers. They're establishing the kind of readers who are looking to read what they already know, when they already know what you're going to say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, okay, I was going to ask you a question about hooks and everything we've been saying today. We've been talking explicitly about nonfiction stuff.
Yes.
But what about fiction? Is there a similar thing? Like, I keep thinking, I've been reading a whole lot of Tolkien on the Kindle here. My daughter loves the stories. I'm telling them in piecemeal to my toddler daughter. And I keep thinking of the opening of The Hobbit. There was a hole in the ground, in a hole in the ground.
Wonderful.
The Hobbit, you know?
Yes.
So is that the same thing, or is it a different?
I think that's the same thing, and not all fiction does this. And again, it's depending on the audience and the genre and how much you can count on your reader. But a lot of short fiction does this. A lot of fiction that is written specifically for ebooks as a platform where they know that people are going to be reading a free sample. They do this, and one of the things that I did in a couple of workshops, and we didn't have time to get to it here, is basically ask people for their favorite opening lines. The one I always come up with is, we were somewhere around Barstow on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that raises this question, and I'm realizing, going back to the Tolkien example, that there's a question inherent in the first sentence, which is, what the heck is a hobbit? In a hole in the ground, the Hobbit.
And why is he living in a hole in the ground? And the problem is, we all know Tolkien in that world so well that there's nothing surprising about that opening. It takes an act of imagination on our part to imagine what the first readers thought.
But in 1946, 1947, or whatever year it is, when he's breaking, he's suddenly breaking world records. That's what it's about.
I recommend,
people are picking it up in the bookstore.
Specifically on the topic of fiction and fiction hooks, for anyone who's interested, just look up famous opening lines, famous first lines online, and you can get a whole bunch of lists of great opening lines from literature and study those. They're great examples, and I did that. My problem is I'm largely addressing people who want to write nonfiction, so I have to explain how to translate some of these great novel openings or great short story openings and how to apply that to a nonfiction piece. But it's absolutely the way to study the psychology of the hook, for sure. I want to make sure, actually, Mike, that we get back to something else that I wanted to say. I'm going to ask you to let me look at what slide it's going to be. I have too many devices here. Okay, slide number 7.
Here.
I said that the single lesson, I said this 7 minutes into the hour, you could have gotten the single most important lesson, which is you do not have a captive audience. I think the second most important lesson is that you don't have to start at the beginning. And I mean that in a couple of different ways.
Huh.
The traditional ways that a lot of people understand that is that a good hook starts in medias res, meaning you're in the middle of a scene. Clearly there's backstory. The reader wants to know the backstory. You give them a cliffhanger, and then you back up and start to explain why you've opened with the middle of a story.
Huh.
That can often be an effective way to open, both in fiction and in nonfiction, especially if you're doing narrative nonfiction. But I also mean it in a very particular way for the writing process, which is one of the first things that many people can do when editing their own stuff is see how well their piece works if they just cut the first paragraph or two. And I still do this. I do this with people who write hundreds and hundreds of articles. I just did it today. I just cut someone's first paragraph because it's like clearing their throat. It's kind of like, well, this is what I think I'm going to be writing about today. And then they get their momentum by the second or third paragraph, and well, open with that. So because we often have a hard time writing an effective beginning at the beginning of our writing process, I want to recommend you not worry about it. I want to recommend you write your ending first. I mean, excuse me, not your ending first. I want to recommend you write your middle first. The middle is where the meat is. The middle is where you're going to make all the points you're going to make. Just start spilling. Don't worry. I know it sounds paradoxical because we're talking about how important the beginning of an article is.
Right.
Don't worry about it at first. Get most of the article written not worrying about the beginning or the end, because the truth is you don't know what to promise at the beginning until you know what you're going to deliver. Only really when I see the general shape, if I can see 70 or 80% of my article in front of me and say, okay, that detail right there is a point I'm going to want to come back to towards the end. I'm going to build it as a hook up front. I'm going to build a curiosity and a question. And then at the very end, I'm going to unhook the reader. And I know that I can deliver on that promise because I've already seen the middle.
Wow.
So that, I gave this advice at ISFLC and was very pleased with myself for this counterintuitive advice. And Max Porter says, I never work that way. So I'm not promising you it'll work. Your mileage may vary. But here's what Max said afterwards, and this was very informative to me. He said, that's actually a really good way to do it if you're struggling with writer's block. And then the other thing he said, which I kind of felt like it conceded the point, was he always starts by writing the hook, but he often comes back and changes his mind once he's written the whole thing. So even if you don't take me at my word, even if you don't put off writing the lead until you're finished, revisit it. You have to go over your draft multiple times before you know what the appropriate shape is. And I think the last thing you should write, even if it turns out to have been the first thing that you wrote, the last thing that you should write or visit in editing is the combination of the hook and the unhook, of the lead and the conclusion. And at 9:58, I managed to say conclusion very close to the end of the hour.
That's pretty good. Okay, so that's right. I've got to wrap it up. We should definitely do another thing like this if people are interested. You guys should let us know in the comment box what kind of more stuff you'd like to have BK back to talk about.
What should we talk about? I'm interested in talking narrative. It's something that I prepared and presented at Charles Koch. It's something that I work on in my own writing. I do at least half of my things are narrative hooks, and I'm very interested in that. But if you're not interested in narrative and you want to talk about something else, you want to talk about writer's block, I've read a whole bunch about writer's block. I have things to say about that. Anything you want to do in a future writer's corner, I'm game.
Interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing it. Meanwhile, I've got to start wrapping it up. So how I like to wrap up a show is a 3-step process. First, I'm going to tell people where to get more great BK Marcus stuff, and I'll put some links in the chat box. And then I'll tell them about some other great stuff coming up on Liberty.me, and then I'll turn it back to BK to give us the final word. So where to get more BK Marcus? Well, the obvious place to start is, of course, BK's own website, bkmarcus.com. Then you should also check out InvisibleOrder.com. We didn't mention this, but BK and I have a company together, InvisibleOrder.com, Libertarian Publishing Solutions. That's worth checking out too. Nowadays that BK is the managing editor of the Freeman. He is all over the place on the Foundation for Economic Education's website, fee.org. Definitely go explore that. And when you're not reading BK, a lot of the stuff you're reading is things that BK has edited or things that BK has selected. And in particular, I refer you to the most recent BK article on that website, which is the one that he referred to at the beginning of the show about writing well, referring to the work of William Zinsser, who says you should ignore your audience. So that's how to get more great BK Marcus. Here's a couple more things from Liberty.me I want to make sure to tell you about. There's just two things I want to make sure to inform you guys on. Number one is, speaking of great writing, for me, the clarity, the sharp clarity of Ludwig von Mises' prose has always stood out, and we've got a show on Sunday night where Jeffrey Tucker is telling us about one of von Mises' greatest works, Socialism. So go and sign up for that. You can enjoy it just a few days from now. And also, I want to remind you guys to go check out the Liberty.me library, which of course was started by BK and is now managed and curated by me. And you can go check that out there. Okay, so now I've said all my promotional stuff I need to know. I'm going to turn it back over to BK to have the last word.
Well, I think I kind of peaked early. I ended with the word conclusion, and then I had everything remotely interesting I had to say. But what I will ask people to do is, if you're interested in these kinds of topics, reach out and friend me on Liberty.me. Mike has already given you the website, but you can write to me at bkmarcus@liberty.me. Talk about what you might want to talk about in a Writer's Corner. If you're interested in submitting to Fee, I can point you to our submission guidelines. If you are interested in trying all this stuff out in your own Liberty.me articles, feel free to point me to them.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, BK. Thank you, everybody, for coming together. I'll see you again on Liberty.me Live. Night, night.
Thank you, everyone.